All right, back with the WMAY morning news feed. Let's now hear about the vaccine mandate that's in place for municipalities. The Illinois Department of Labor issuing that emergency temporary standard, reflecting what the federal government has in place right now for employers over 100 employees. Now, it's important to understand that the Illinois Department of Labor, their rules only apply to public sector employment, while the federal rule applies to all employment, public and private. But that rule by the federal government is very much up in the air right now with the U.S. Supreme Court. So we'll see what happens with that when it ultimately there's some decision made. But I connected with Illinois Municipal League Executive Director Brad Cole to get a breakdown of sorts of what this means for municipalities. And ultimately, who is going to be impacted by this, the vaccine or the testing mandate? So again, for employers over 100, you've got this mandate in place to require COVID-19 vaccine or testing for the employees. So here's some of what Illinois Municipal League Executive Director Brad Cole has to say about the testing or the vaccine mandate.
Illinois is a state plan under OSHA, and so they will be required to comply with the federal order. And just last week, the State Department of Labor issued that statement basically saying that effective January 24th, they will be complying to the same extent as the federal order. So it does impact both private employers and public employers if they have more than 100 employees. So for local governments, it won't impact the smallest of them, but for the larger communities, it will.
So for the larger communities, I asked kind of for a roundabout way of who's going to be impacted by that. And he kind of gave a bit of an estimation of sorts of the population size of municipalities that are going to be impacted by this vaccine mandate. Again, because it's only for those employers of 100 or more employees.
I would say it's mostly communities probably around 10,000 or more in population. Generally, those would be the ones that would have a workforce that includes all of their employees that would be reaching up to the 100 or more.
So I'm sharing a conversation I had with Brad Cole from the Illinois Municipal League, chatted with him yesterday about the vaccine mandate that's on public employers of more than 100 employees while we wait for whatever the outcome is going to be with the U.S. Supreme Court. Because if the U.S. Supreme Court shoots down the Biden administration's vaccine mandate, then Illinois' mandate would be withdrawn. And the state could then file its own mandate. But the way the mandate's in place right now, the Department of Labor says they're just complying with the federal standard as the U.S. Supreme Court continues to deal with this. But there's still some overarching questions that Brad Cole and other municipalities all across the state have about the rule.
I think there are still some overarching questions, and you'll see that that's why the state has allowed about 30 days to actually get in compliance once the rule is effective. And so the testing piece will obviously be dependent on the availability of tests. We've seen the federal government and lately the state government coming out with more availability for that. But that's going to be an issue with things like this. Anything, there's always the unintended consequence, and the logistics of enforcing it are one of those. So we'll see a number of people that comply through the vaccination requirement, a number that will want to do the testing.
Now, one thing that's noted here, the Illinois Department of Labor's rule is temporary. It's only good until, I think, July 24th.
So it's for less than 6 months at this point. And I would assume or hope that things will get better much sooner than that. So it may not be an issue for very long.
So we'll see if that's the case. If it does expire, if the U.S. Supreme Court allows it to stay, at least on the federal level. So we'll watch that. But there's also the advice that the Illinois Municipal League is giving to municipalities across the state.
Yeah, we've encouraged communities and local government leaders to begin developing their plan and to begin developing their procedures for how they can implement this so that it's not a last-minute issue, and to work with both their collective bargaining units and their regular non-bargaining unit employees so that they can come up with something that everybody will agree to and that they can implement it safely and easily. The more time to do that, the better, which is why we've told people they should be prepared as of January 10th. And of course, all this then is going to depend on what the United States Supreme Court says. But ultimately, municipalities need to have a plan in place to be able to implement this if necessary. And if they choose to do so on their own anyway, it doesn't require a state or federal order if they wish to do this. So some local governments have put this in place for themselves already, and they can do that. So being able to do it helps them, whether it's a mandate or on their own course of decision making.
Sharing some of the conversation I had with Illinois Municipal League Executive Director Brad Cole about the vaccine or testing mandate that's currently in place for larger municipalities. And again, it would be for likely those municipalities who work for populations of 10,000 or more. So you can kind of gauge as to which municipalities are impacted by this if they have more than 100 employees. So one of the big questions also is what was raised at the U.S. Supreme Court on Friday. And opponents of the Biden administration's rule said if it's allowed to stand, it could lead to a mass exodus of people from the workforce, not just the private sector, but also the public sector. And that's a concern that Cole says municipalities always have. They're always concerned about retention.
I think it's always a concern. You want to make sure you retain your employees. Of course, this is not a one-way mandate. There is the option, so it's not vaccine or out, it's vaccination or testing. I would hope that people who would not want to be vaccinated would not object to testing. If they don't want to do either one, then that does become an employment issue and a decision that either they or their employer will have to make. But there's no reason for it to get to that point if people can work cooperatively, and that's why I said spend the time now to develop a program that both management and labor can agree to.
Now, part of this rule includes what's acceptable for proof of vaccine and, documents and attestations by employees and so on. Another big question is who's going to enforce this, especially if it's a temporary rule. It's only going to be in place for 6 months. That is, if the U.S. Supreme Court doesn't shoot it down. So these are just, again, some more looming questions that municipalities likely have. More from Brad Cole.
Well, that's a question that we've received. Who is going to enforce this? The employer is going to have to enforce it with the employee as far as implementing it. But I would assume that ultimately it will be the State Department of Labor or the state itself that will have to determine what penalties there are, if there are any. And I would hope that we wouldn't get to that phase, that we would get to a compliance phase instead of an enforcement phase.
So one thing to consider here is with the rule that's in place now, again, until we get some clarification from the U.S. Supreme Court of which way they're going to go if they shoot it down and this rule gets withdrawn. But it includes, the issues of falsifying evidence, falsifying data, falsifying documents. And it says that where employees are unable to produce acceptable proof of vaccination, a signed and dated statement by the employee must attest to their vaccination status with a declaration, including that they understand that knowingly providing false information regarding vaccination status on this form may subject them to criminal penalties. And those criminal penalties could be upwards to 5 years in prison. Now, employers, the rule states, must maintain a roster of each employee's vaccine status for possible review by authorities, personnel, authorized people, like with the Department of Labor, for instance, and the employer's records or ascertainment of vaccine status for each such person constitutes acceptable proof of vaccine. So if you work in a municipality with more than 10,000 people that it serves, if there's more than 100 employees at the municipality, you're likely getting messages and memos from your employer saying you've got to prove your vaccine status or you've got to submit to weekly tests. This, as the question also remains of what kind of test is acceptable? Are home administered tests acceptable, or is it only a test that's acceptable if it's from a doctor? And we're seeing that those questions still very much up in the air when it comes to being able to prove your COVID-19 status. All right, now 6:32. We will, of course, get to a whole bunch